Hey, this is Hernando, and this is the first episode of the Creek DAYLO podcast. I'm joined by Emily as well as Mr. Josh Malkin, a legislative advocate with the ACLU of South Carolina. Thanks for coming in today.
My pleasure.
Recently, there's been a lot of headlines about executive orders, new federal and state laws, as well as new proposed legislation.
So much of what we are hearing about affects our education, nationally and on a state level. Two areas of interest for us as members of DAYLO are an anti-DEI bill and a book censorship law. We're hoping that you can help us understand and make more sense about what is going on.
Could you explain to us roughly what the DEI bill is?
Yeah, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion bill, what it does is it says you can't discriminate illegally. That is what Chairwoman Erickson said at the State House. And so that means you can't give preferential treatment based on race, gender, religion, national origin, sexual orientation. You can't give preferential treatment. You can't have an office that gives preferential treatment. You can't contract work out to anyone that, has diversity, equity, and inclusion policies. That's the main crux of it. So when she got up and she said, we're just saying you can't discriminate illegally, I think that's a really smart thing for a politician to say. But you already can't discriminate illegally, right? So the questions it raises for me are, why are we spending so much of our time on a bill that says you already can't do something you already can't do? Also, the reality of this current political moment is what illegal discrimination means is changing pretty drastically, right? So this bill could mean something very different in a year's time. And the third piece is I always want to believe the best of our legislators until they give me reason to believe otherwise. But I've been around the state enough to kind of see how this bill will be weaponized. So the language is one thing, and Chairwoman Erickson could believe one thing about this bill. What she can't control is how folks in Beaufort County who don't like gay kids or don't want kids learning Black history are going to come and attack y'all's educators, y'all's administrators. There's nothing she can do about that once it becomes law, which is why it's always my belief that we shouldn't be giving those folks another vehicle to weaponize against, your incredible educators and administrators.
Do you know what is legal discrimination, or is that a term that's been used before? Because if there's illegal, I would assume there's also legal.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think hypothetically, a private business owner that runs a small business
Is within their right.
It is within their right for a business owner with fewer than 15 employees to discriminate. If you are a governmental employer or a private employer with more than 15 employees, you can't discriminate based on any of those factors we talked about: race, gender.
I did want to talk about how you spoke on how illegal discrimination is mentioned within the bill. It seems to be raising lots of ambiguity, and I feel like that ambiguity could be abused either in positive or negative ways. Yeah.
I worry about the negative ambiguity because, again, this is not my first time looking at how the language of a bill has been weaponized. So I'm sure we'll get to book bans at some point. But when you talk about material that's harmful to minors, that means something in the law. But what folks who want to ban books say is, no, this has some paragraph with sex in it and it's porn. So I worry that a lot of the people impacted by this law won't know what illegal discrimination necessarily means. Why would an educator or an administrator necessarily know what counts as illegal discrimination? And two, the folks who attack diversity, equity, inclusion won't know and won't care what illegal discrimination means. They'll just come in and say, hey, you're in violation of 3927. I'm going to report you to the Attorney General's office. And then what happens is people overcomply, right? Which is what we saw with the book bans in Beaufort. The book banners first called like the solicitor and the sheriff, and they were both like, well, this is ridiculous. These are books, and there's, you don't have to read the books, but they're books and they're not what you say they are. But they still pulled all 97 books, right? Because I think there was some fear amongst the school board of what could happen.
And speaking of that, you talked about how teachers wouldn't necessarily know what illegal discrimination is and legal discrimination. Is there any like sort of training to understand that more that they're putting out?
I would hope so. I mean, there are two, and this is getting probably into some stuff that might be boring for y'all, but there are like two teacher organizations in the state that hypothetically should be training teachers, but not every teacher is a member of one of those organizations because you do have to pay to be a member. And do they get into every school district to provide the training? Do administrators in certain places allow those trainings to happen? I don't know. So in an ideal world, yeah, teachers would be getting training.
I wanted to bring up a quote from the anti-DEA bill, DEI, excuse me. It says, illegal DEI policies also threaten the safety of men, women, and children across South Carolina by diminishing the importance of individual merit, aptitude, hard work, and determination when selecting people for jobs and services in key sectors of American society. Do you think that the existence of DEI has devalued merit in our society?
I don't. And is that from the beginning of the bill, that kind of the preamble? I don't. I think that we have always lived in a country where systems have benefited people who look like me. That has been the natural course of things. Systems have been and still are designed to benefit white men. And I just think maybe, the death of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement, there's been a few years of people talking about, okay, how do we make society more fair? And I guess some people are just like tired of having that conversation despite us not really making progress towards racial gender equality. So not only do I not think diversity, equity, and inclusion are not dangerous, I think we need to actually invest in equity if we want to counteract these centuries of systemic inequality that this country has seen.
Do you think that the bill is more dangerous than it not being a thing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, when they said this was like a copy of President Trump's bill, right? Mm-hmm. So if they want to, we can look to see how that bill is how the executive order is being weaponized and what the fallout of that has been. They're taking books about Black history away from the Naval Academy. They're scrubbing their websites of certain words. They changed I think Air Force member's Medal of Honor was a black man, and they called it a DEI Medal of Honor. So if they can talk about merit, and they can even say they believe that, but when you look to see how this is actually being implemented and executed in the real world, it's pretty clearly both a historical erasure of inequities and accomplishments of members of minority groups. And also, I think the real design here, not necessarily by our lawmakers, but the animus behind it, is they don't want y'all to understand that systems are designed to create unequal outcomes, because then y'all won't be able to work together to solve it. And I think, unfortunately, that's really the driving goal for the people behind this movement. And again, I'll clarify, that's not Chairwoman Erickson. It's not anyone in South Carolina. Politics is national. This is coming down from Washington, D.C. and President Trump. But I worry that our South Carolina lawmakers don't understand the impact this bill could have. For example, Black women are 3 to 4 times more likely to die during pregnancy than white women. Right? We need to acknowledge that and understand it if we want to reduce that inequality. But if this bill is weaponized to say, no, we're not going to give out a research grant that's looking at a racial disparity in maternal mortality, we can't understand it. We can't solve it. And if anything, the problem will get worse.
I find it interesting how like the effects of this bill can obviously like reach out to schools and stuff like that, but like you just said with that statistic, like it can affect the literal like lives of people.
Oh, 100%. 100%. I mean, there are diseases that sickle cell anemia, you can only have sickle cell anemia if you're a Black American. You only get Tay-Sachs disease if you're a Jewish American. So if we're going to say that providing funding to study a disease that only impacts one subset of the population is illegal discrimination, we can never make progress towards curing that disease.
Would that also apply for the opposing race, like white people, if they had a disease that was very specific? Do you think that they would be as hardcore on the DEI bill? Since it is, like, say white women had just as much struggle with pregnancy as Black women, do you think that they would still push the anti-DEI bill just as much?
No. No. I think if we had racial equality, we wouldn't be talking about this. And I think this bill, again, is kind of meant to stifle conversation and investigation of inequalities. And not just racial, right? Gender, sexual orientation, national origin, religious.
I think that like the biggest impact of this bill is obviously like the direct impacts it has, but what I've seen like multiple times, I guess looking at history, is that when you complicate like the lives of people on the day to day, they like are slowly just going to care less and less about either speaking up against things because they don't have the time in their day to, you know, go to the state house and fight for something. You know, they need to take their kids to school, or they need to go to work, or they have 1,000 other things, and that's just the last thing on their list.
I mean, I think you're right, and I think unfortunately, I will say we had 4.5 to 5 hours of public testimony. So there were a ton of people at the State House. Not a single person spoke in favor of this bill. Everyone spoke in opposition. But you're absolutely right. The people who are furthest from power are so often the people most impacted by bills like this, right? So people working 2 jobs, right? Making sure their kids get to school, their kids get fed. They may not know that this bill is being debated in South Carolina. And yeah, they're not going to be able to take off work and say, hey, I oppose this bill. I'm worried about the impact this bill could have on my everyday life.
Do you think that since the bill has such an effect on so many different people, like sexual oriented, that are different from the normal like straight and then the 2 genders, how that's going to affect them within like classrooms, how they aren't allowed to have the inclusivity part of like we are all welcome here? How do you think that's going to affect the bullying rates?
That's a great question. Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be really interesting to see like how do school handbooks potentially change, right? Things like that. If you can't talk to, it's just so, that question really infuriates me, right? Because like and maybe things have gotten better since I was in junior high school and high school, but like gay students really got bullied. Like life was miserable for gay students. My brother came out when he was in 9th grade. And so to now not be able to say, you know, just have conversations about how people are different, and we still treat every individual with dignity. And the fact that like our lawmakers are now essentially bullying minority groups with legislation, yeah, it is a terrifying leap in the wrong direction.
I just wanted to talk about how you mentioned minority groups being bullied by legislation. I think that ties in like directly with House Bill 43-170, the selection of instructional materials for school libraries regulation, and just everything that's going on with book banning in South Carolina.
Yeah. Let's talk book bans in South Carolina. So yes, there are book bans that are inherently racist, right? And y'all, I'm trying to think about your list of 96. Like, I know stamped racism, anti-racism in you has been challenged in at least 2 districts in the state, right? So that is just because people don't want students having access to books that talk about racism. And yes, there are challenges to books that just because they feature gay characters like Flamer, the graphic novel, right? And then what 43-170 does is it says any book with sexual content, so that's any sex, sexual violence, like a depiction of genitalia or a nipple or excretion, guys, that's sexual content, is age inappropriate for students of all ages. That means like 4 to 18, right? So under this regulation, technically, if your high school library had everybody poops, which it probably doesn't because it's not age appropriate for you guys anyway, but if it did, I could challenge that and that book would be banned from you all, a book about potty training. That's what the regulation says. There's one definition of age appropriateness for students of all ages, and it's any mention of all of those things.
It's crazy how they have one set definition for a massive age range.
Right. Like, what does age appropriate mean? Board of Ed? It's for different, and children, folks can be the same age and be at different reading levels, be at different maturity levels as well. But to say a 5-year-old and an 18-year-old should have access to the same reading materials, it's bonkers.
I think that they are banning, like, putting that age appropriateness so hardcore onto, like, teenagers who definitely already know all of the things that they're counting as unage appropriate.
Right.
So how do we go about going against that?
I mean, in this moment in time, we just continue to speak up. And I'll say we got some good news. What was it, last week? When the book ban regulation was going through, we told them, like, this is a poorly written regulation. This will have consequences you all do not anticipate. And after a year and a half of showing up at every single State Board of Ed meeting, the State Board of Ed finally said last week, like, let's pump the brakes. We're seeing how this regulation is playing out. And one woman in Beaufort being able to ban 96 books for the entire state, right? But the regulations, she tried in Beaufort. And folks got together, they read the books, they said, okay, this has some tough passages, but I read the book, and the book has merit as a whole, and parents can opt their kids out. But 91 of the books went back on shelves in Beaufort. And now she has this regulation. If she wants to challenge a book and it has any sexual content, the book gets banned for every child in the state. I mean, I think banning books for one district is dangerous enough, but now you give one woman the power to ban a book, to make a decision for every child and every parent in the state. That's not America.
Yeah, I think questions arising about this lady is like the first step in the right direction, because 96 books is crazy. So when does it stop for her?
Right.
And I think the fact that they're asking that question is huge, as well as them tabling the vote on the 10 books recently.
Yes. A lot of folks feel overwhelmed in this moment because there's a lot going on and there's a lot of harm happening. But I think last week goes to show you that, like, speaking up does matter, and it gets tiring. You need to find joy and find community, but speaking up does matter, and it is necessary.
Do you think that at some point they are going to limit how much you can push for the hatred of, like, books and banning them? Is that something that has been even, like, a thought in the making?
I think there are some members on the state board who are educators who don't agree with this regulation. So yeah, I don't know when this moment ends. I hate that we're living in this moment. But yeah, this moment will end. I just don't know when.
It's incredible that our people who are making decisions on our education are not educated themselves on something that fundamental. Have there been any, like, proposed amendments to the bill and how the process works? Because I could definitely think of a few ways the process should be altered or just completely rewritten.
Yeah, so I still am having trouble, like, wrapping my head around how you actually amend a regulation. It's not technically a law, it's a regulation. So there are a few steps that need to occur there. But I do think the board is going to have some real conversations about what this regulation currently lets single individuals do to every student and parent in the state.
So we read a book The Perks of Being a Wallflower, and it had a very deep meaning and it had a lot of merit, but it got banned for the sexual content that it withheld. But it was like sexual assault and sexual violence. So that pertains to that kind of. And since the board members don't have to read it, how does that affect us in the future?
So I am extremely troubled by the erasure of sex and sexual violence in books. But I will also say this: survivors of sexual violence are not a monolith. They're not all the same, right? So if a survivor of sexual violence gets up there and says, I think it's going to be traumatic for a student who reads about sexual violence, right? They think it's going to be re-triggering. That parent should do whatever they need to do to find books with sexual violence and opt their student out of books with sexual violence. That being said, I think it's extremely important that students have access to books that feature healthy and unhealthy sexual relationships, so you know that when a relationship is okay or not okay. Because let's be honest, not every student, you're not getting that information in school, and not every child is getting it at home. So if we're erasing information about what it is okay for somebody else to do to you, then you may not know that like someone violating your personal space is not okay. And I think that's extremely dangerous.
I don't think I was taught a lot. I was in a different state, so I can't speak for South Carolina. But we weren't taught a lot about what consent and not non-consent was. We were taught more about like sexual diseases. Mm-hmm. And in that sense, banning these books would highly affect how students learn, because that was how I learned what consent and not consent was. I learned it through a book. So in that sense, what can we take to go like action against this and show that the sexual content is important inside of a book?
I think young people just need to continue to speak up, and it is frustrating and disheartening when people of any age are ignored. But I think that y'all especially, your voices are especially powerful, because folks are taking away your rights, and your right to read freely, and your right to access information.
I feel like the perspective of educators should be like really highly valued when bringing bills like this up for proposal.
It's so armor hammering into it's armor hammering into teachers' careers and how they treat their students and the relationship that they're allowed to have. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's really scary.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, one is I don't think non-educators understand how difficult it is to be an educator, or how much educators care about their students, right? I just don't think you can really understand that until you've been an educator. And two, I think a lot of these attacks, which are meant to be attacks on educators' expertise, are meant to do just that. They're meant to tell future educators, you don't want to do this, because as little as educators were ever respected, now we're really saying they don't know what they're doing. The other day at a state board of ed meeting, this woman gets up there and she called a bunch of librarians and my organization and some other groups porn pushers. Now, that actually, you can't do that. The freedom of speech does not allow you to do that, but nobody stopped her, right? So if now you're an educator who just wants kids to love to read, and this woman is allowed to get up there and defame you, and no one is going to stop her?
In a state building in front of
Exactly.
representatives.
Exactly. So the fact that there are not, and I'll get Chairwoman Erickson, I've seen her do this a few times. She has stopped people when they are being disrespectful. But the fact there should be a bipartisan response when people are so explicitly disrespectful of our educators. And that is extremely frustrating. And you do have a lot of lifelong educators on the State Board of Education. You don't in the State House, but in the State Board of Education, a good number of that board are lifelong educators. So one of them did say, like, I know my librarians, I love my librarians, but it came later on in the meeting. Someone should have just immediately been like, no, you can say what you want about these books, but you're not going to say this about people.
Do you think, in the perspective that people aren't viewing others as like human beings with their own personality, and like librarians having that kind of like they are their own person and they're personable people for your children and not just like people that are handing out these sexually explicit books or, as you said, porn pushers? Do you think that they think of these people as like human beings, like a mom, a dad, or like a owner to like a cat or something?
Yeah, we're really getting into it. I think that it's gotten. I think what we saw before was that a lot of the book challenges were coming from folks who did not have kids in the schools, right? I think it is easier to dehumanize and criticize and insult someone you don't know. Or if you get up there and you say the entire organization of librarians is this thing, you don't feel it the same way you would. People aren't saying it about their kids' educators or their kids' librarians for the most part, right? Like that doesn't typically happen. But people are seeing librarians and educators as like these people, as faceless people they don't know, and that makes it easier for them to attack them.
Kind of like cyberbullying, where you can go in
Exactly.
and attack online, but they're doing it in a state level
Exactly.
and it's allowed.
Exactly.
The lack of like education and perspective on topics they're complaining about is like crazy, considering how passionate they feel about certain things, even though like they might not have a clue about what's actually being done.
Yeah. Yeah, it is really wild and dangerous that people think they should be able to make a decision for every parent in the state. You know, like where does that stop?
Yeah. And thinking about it, you're not only affecting your own child, you're also affecting everyone else's kid. And if you ask these parents, would you let another parent control what your child reads?
Exactly.
They automatically say no.
Exactly. But only twice have people come up to me and try to like actually have a conversation with me. Because I would really like to try to get a deeper understanding of how they're thinking. Because I hope it's something other than like, this is my belief, and my belief should be able to control everyone in the state.
It's just so interesting how people will push their opinion so hardcore onto other children and not just their own, and like take action within their own child's life. And I feel like a lot of the parents who are going against these specific books aren't quite as involved in their own child's life to see how it would really affect them and their group around them.
Right. Right. So there was a board member on the State Board of Education, and he's an older gentleman. And every time he replies to someone's email, he makes it seem as if these books featuring sexual violence are in elementary school libraries, right? So there just seems to be no way to get through to him to be like, no one is giving. First of all, libraries are for students to choose, right? So it's not like anyone is giving certain Sarah J. Maas books out in class, but no one is giving a 6-year-old the perks of being a wallflower. And it seems to be what some of these people think. And it's just like, okay, I hear you. You've been misled. Now let me like tell you what's actually factual.
So how does that make sense?
Yeah, I feel like in real time we're seeing our representatives fail the people, because what I've been told is the representatives represent the people, but that doesn't seem to be the case.
So the book ban regulation, as a regulation, did start with the State Department of Ed. So it is a different governing body than the State House, although I do believe that the House did vote and accepted it. But yeah, book bans are wildly unpopular because I think a lot of folks see them as, why does one person have the right to tell my kid what they can read? My kid and I can determine what they can read. So they're wildly unpopular. But the fact that you have, the folks who are most willing to like defame educators and intimidate folks and be loud and talk about porn inaccurately are having this effect on the state. It would be nice to see our lawmakers with some more courage, encouraged to stand up for, as you said, like ideals that are actually popular in South Carolina. Banning a book is not popular in South Carolina. So we're listening to a very loud and scary minority in this state.
And with that, how it's affecting, like how these parents are going against what their own children are learning. And obviously, yes, you do want to have an active participation within your child's educational life, but I feel like they also aren't getting into like the nitty gritty of what their child is learning when they're pushing out these books saying that it's porn or that it is defamatory to a specific group of people. I feel as if they aren't allowing themselves to be put into that situation and then figure out what is appropriate and inappropriate for their own child, but not every other child.
Right.
And they're speaking against and defaming educators who are teaching their child,
Right.
which doesn't make sense.
Yes.
Did want to ask one question, or if you could say one thing before we leave, just overall in terms of the anti-DEI bill and the book regulations, what can we as students who aren't of voting age yet do to make change?
Reach out to your representatives and do your research, because they could come back to you with some talking points that could be dismissive. But we've already seen how the anti-diversity, equity, inclusion attacks have played out nationally. So if they're going to copy the national language, just go in well researched, so you can, that you will be the experts in the room, and they should value your perspective and respect your expertise.
Perfect. All right.
Well,
Thank
that
you.
was today's podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, Mr.
My
Malkin.
pleasure. What an honor to be the inaugural guest.
All right.
The first podcast. Thank you.